To access all audiobook recordings without ad interruptions, please visit the links below. Thank you for your support. Blood Lies by Grover Furr. Chapter 3. Snyder, Chapter 1, Appendix. In order to make the main text of this book a more readable narrative, we have added appendices to several of the chapters of this analysis. In these appendices are presented direct quotations from Bloodlands, together with our dissection and critique of the assertions Snyder makes in them. We have examined and critiqued every fact claim of an anti-Stalin or anti-Soviet tendency in Bloodlands. Those that are not studied and critiqued in the main chapters are covered in the appendices. In addition, the full texts of some of the longer documents that are referred to in the body of each chapter are contained in the appendices. This too improves the readability of the main text, while still making additional important documentation available to scholars or whoever wants it. Each section or unit in the appendices is comprised of the following elements: a quotation from Bloodlands, where the Soviet Union or a pro-Soviet force is accused of some crime, misdeed, etc. These quotations contain some assertion or fact claim. The text of the footnotes, which constitute the evidence or proof of Snyder's fact claims. Our study and analysis of the evidence in the footnotes. Our conclusion as to whether Snyder's fact claims have been verified or, as almost always is the case, proven to be fraudulent. Whenever possible, we have provided each unit with a title in boldface. These titles are intended only for shorthand reference. They do not fully reflect the contents of the paragraph of Snyder's text that is analyzed in the unit below. Unlike the main body of the book, these appendices do not constitute a flowing narrative. Some readers will content themselves to studying our critique of Snyder's principal allegations, which is contained in other chapters. Others will want to go further and study our critique of some or all of the anti-Soviet allegations Snyder makes in the book, but that are not examined in the texts of the chapters themselves. The Starving Children. Snyder, pages 22 to 23, gives some anecdotal accounts of famine-stricken children. A number might be true, but are not recorded in any of the sources Snyder cites. Quote, "Starving peasants begged along the bread lines asking for crumbs. In one town, a 15-year-old girl begged her way to the front of the line only to be beaten to death by the shopkeeper. The city housewives making the queues had to watch as peasant women starved to death on the sidewalks. A girl walking to and from school each day saw the dying in the morning and the dead in the afternoon. One young communist called the peasant children he saw living skeletons. A party member in industrial Stalino was distressed by the corpses of the starved that he found at his back door. Couples strolling in parks could not miss the signs forbidding the digging of graves. Doctors and nurses were forbidden from treating or feeding the starving who reached their hospitals. The city police seized famished urchins from city streets to get them out of sight. In Soviet Ukrainian cities, policemen apprehended several hundred children a day. One day in early 1933, the Kharkiv police had a quota of 2,000 to fill. About 20,000 children awaited death in the barracks of Kharkiv at any given time. The children pleaded with the police to be allowed at least to starve in the open air. "Let me die in peace. I don't want to die in the death barracks." Sources, note 4, page 463. Quotations, Folk, Sovjetska Stata, 299, see also 297 to 301. Kuzner's Ukraina, page 157, page 160. On the Schoolgirl and the Hospitals, see Davies' Years, 160, 220, see also Kuramaya, Freedom and Terror, 171, 184. Snyder's claim in this paragraph that about 20,000 children awaited deaths in the barracks of Kharkiv at any given time is not documented by any of the sources Snyder cites. Folk, Sovjetska Stata, 299, contains a quotation in German translation from the report of a Komsomol activist to the Kharkov City Soviet on July 4th, 1933, describing peasant children coming into Kharkov. When one looks at the children, one sees living skeletons. Kuzner's 157. The quotation, "Let me die in peace, I don't want to die in the death barracks," is here. Snyder states that it was the about 20,000 children in the barracks of Kharkiv who made this plea. This is false. According to Kuzner's, Snyder's source, it was the homeless children in the streets who said this to policemen. What's more, the source of this is the Italian consul in Kharkov. In other words, a fascist. Hardly a reliable source. Kuzner's 156, not 157, citing a Ukrainian nationalist source, says that 27,454 homeless children were rounded up in the whole Kharkov Oblast by May 28, 1933. It does not say that all or indeed any of these children were in the barracks of Kharkiv or awaiting death, as Snyder claims. Evidence cited below shows that children were given special priority for emergency food supplies and that the Soviet Politburo, Stalin, issued some of these orders. Kuzner's notes, page 156, note 277, that, according to other data, 6,378 children had been taken from the streets of Kharkov by the end of May 1933. This figure is contained in Kuzner's source, document 233. This document appears to reflect attempts by the Kharkov city authorities to aid homeless children. Snyder has fabricated the claim that the purpose was to get them, the homeless children, out of sight. It is not in his source. Kuzner's 160. The schoolgirl story is here, not in Davies' years. Kuzner's quotes it in Polish translation from the collection published by the U.S. Congress in 1990, Oral History Project of the Commission of the Ukraine Famine, page 1588. Page 1588 is in Volume 3 of this work. Kuzner's errs in copying her name, calling her Olga Lodgaya. In reality, she identified herself as Olga Oldliga, née Anatova. In the Ukrainian language interview, Oldliga refuses to testify that she saw policemen arresting starving people, despite leading questions by the Ukrainian-speaking interviewer. Davies, years 160-220, despite Snyder's claim, has nothing at all about the schoolgirl and the hospitals. However, on pages 221 FF, Davies and Wheatcroft outline Soviet efforts to help Ukrainian children. Considerable efforts were made to supply grain to hungry children, irrespective of their parents' roles in society. The Vinnytsia decision of April 29th, insisting that most grain should be distributed to those who were active in agriculture, also allocated grain specifically to creches and children's institutes in the badly hit districts. On May 20th, the USSR Politburo in Moscow, led by Stalin, issued a grain loan to the Crimea, specifically for children in need and aged invalids. Snyder fails to inform his readers about these and similar efforts documented in Davies and Wheatcroft. This work is one of the most important studies of the 1932-1933 famine, along with those by Mark Tauger, and firmly concludes that it was not deliberate in any way. A similar resolution of February 22, 1933, by the Kiev Oblast Bureau of the Ukrainian Communist Party to provide food relief to all those struck by famine is reproduced in translation in the 1997 Library of Congress volume Revelations from the Russian Archives, edited by Diane P. Kochner and Ronald D. Bachman, as document 187 on pages 417 to 418. These works refute Snyder's entire hypothesis of a deliberate famine, for if the Stalin regime wanted to deliberately starve Ukrainians, why would it take special measures to feed hungry children and aged invalids? Kiromaya, Freedom and Terror, 171-184. 171 relates the 15-year-old girl beaten to death by the shopkeeper story. Snyder distorts the story by omitting the detail that the storekeeper was communist. although the original version and Kurumaya, Snyder's source, include it. Why? Could it be because this detail, making the shopkeeper a communist, makes the whole story seem phony, sound like anti-communists going overboard? But there is a more serious problem with this story. It is taken from The Black Deeds of the Kremlin, Volume 1, page 284. Its source is an unidentified person using the name Mariupolsky. The story is set in the town of Mariupol. This book was published in the mid-1950s by Ukrainian immigrants in Canada who had collaborated with the Nazis and written hair-raising anti-Semitic propaganda to recruit other Ukrainians to the pro-Nazi forces. At least one identifiable Ukrainian fascist recounts a story in it. There is no reason to accept any of them as true. Eyewitness stories are notoriously unreliable as history under any circumstances. A volume of self-serving, largely anonymous stories by Nazi collaborators such as this one is even more unreliable as history. Moreover, the volume claims that there was plenty of food in Russian areas outside the Ukraine, an absurd statement that even fervent anti-communists do not make today. This collection became known beyond the circles of Nazi collaborators only because Robert Conquest cited it many times in his 1986 book, Harvest of Sorrow. Conquest was paid by the Ukrainian nationalists to write this book. The work is never cited except by extreme anti-communists, such as Kurumaya. Moreover, Conquest has repudiated his original accusation that the famine is deliberate, as we discuss below. Kurumaya, Freedom and Terror, page 184, does not document anything at all in Snyder's paragraph. Conclusion: many of Snyder's claims in this paragraph are not in the sources he cites. The city housewives making the queues, the party member in Stalino, the allegation that doctors and nurses were forbidden to treat the starving, the quota that the Kharkiv police supposedly had, the story of the about 20,000 children in the death barracks, none are documented. But even if they were true, none of these stories would be evidence for Snyder's insistence that the famine was either caused by collectivization or constituted the deliberate starvation of Ukrainians. Snyder begs the question of the famine, assumes what he needs to prove. Snyder: the mass starvation of 1933 was the result of Stalin's first 5-year plan implemented between 1928 and 1932. In those years, Stalin had taken control of the heights of the Communist Party, forced through a policy of industrialization and collectivization, and emerged as the frightful father of a beaten population. He had transformed the market into the plan, farmers into slaves, and the wastes of Siberia and Kazakhstan into a chain of concentration camps. His policies had killed tens of thousands by execution, hundreds of thousands by exhaustion, and put millions at risk of starvation. Pages 24 to 25, emphasis added. Note 8. For a sophisticated guide to the meaning of the plan, see Harrison, Soviet Planning, pages 1 through 5. Snyder cites no evidence whatsoever to support this paragraph of invective. We have dealt or are dealing with the falsehoods in boldface. In reality, like all previous famines in Russian and Ukrainian history, this famine, too, had environmental, not human, causes. Harrison, Soviet Planning 1 through 5, is a very brief introduction to what Harrison sees as the tensions between balance and voluntarism within Soviet economic planning in the early 1930s, concluding that there was a sense in which these two tendencies, needed each other. It contains nothing, no evidence or even reference, to Snyder's claim of frightful father, beaten population, peasants as slaves, or concentration camps. It does not even support Snyder's claim that collectivization caused the famine. The lie of slave labor. One hallmark of anti-communist bias and falsification is to call Soviet collective farmers or labor camp prisoners slaves. The penal systems of the United States today and in many other countries employ the labor of prisoners. This is never called slave labor. The proper term used for prisoners' labor in all capitalist countries is penal labor. Peasants on collective farms, kolkhozes, and Soviet farms, sovkhozes, had nothing in common with the institution of slavery any more than they did with serfdom. Neither did prisoners in the Soviet gulag. A writer who uses that term is making no attempt to be accurate and so is likely to be untruthful about other matters too, but the basic point to note here is that Snyder assumes that which is to be proven, instead of citing evidence that the 5-year plan and collectivization resulted in the famine. Snyder simply states it as a fact. We have already shown that Mark Tauger and Davies and Wheatcroft have established that the famine was not caused by collectivization but by environmental factors like virtually all the numerous famines that preceded it. Quotations from these authors are in the main body of Chapter 1 of this book. Was the threat of mass starvation clear to Stalin by June 1932? Snyder. The threat of mass starvation was utterly clear to Soviet Ukrainian authorities, and it became so to Stalin that same day, 18 June 1932. Stalin himself admitted privately that there was famine in Soviet Ukraine. The previous day, the Ukrainian party leadership had requested food aid. He did not grant it. His response was that all grain in Soviet Ukraine must be collected as planned. He and Kaganovich agreed that it is imperative to export without fail immediately. Note 34. On the reports of death by starvation, see Kuzner's 104-105 on Stalin, see Davies, Kaganovich Correspondence 138. On the request for food aid, see Lee, Letters to Molotov 230. On Kaganovich, 23 June 1932, see Hunkzuk, Famine 121. Nothing in any of the sources cited by Snyder here gives any evidence that the threat of mass starvation became clear to Stalin. On the contrary, these sources show that in mid-1932, the Soviet leadership was far from recognizing that a devastating famine was to come. Kuzner's 104-105 contains several reports about starvation. These reports contain nothing about and are therefore irrelevant to charges of man-made famine and deliberate starvation. Davies, Kaganovich Correspondence 138, in this letter of Stalin's of June 18, 1932, page 179 of the Russian edition, Stalin explains to Kaganovich his conclusion that the starvation that does exist in places in the Ukraine is the result of improper accounting by the grain collection teams who, instead of accounting for differences, have been taking the same from everyone. Quote, the mechanical equalizing approach to the matter has resulted in glaring absurdities, so that a number of fertile districts in the Ukraine, despite a fairly good harvest, have found themselves in a state of impoverishment and famine, while the regional party committee in the Urals has deprived itself of the capacity to use the districts with good crops in the region to assist regions with bad harvests. End quote. 5 days later, on June 23, 1932, Kaganovich wrote to Stalin that, in his opinion, the quantity of grain for the third quarter of 1932 must be somewhat reduced. Snyder does not mention this. Quote, on July 10, 1932, the PV Politburo decided to lower the indicated amount of grain for export in the third quarter and to establish it firmly on July 16th. At the PB session of July 16th, the export of grain for the third quarter was set at 31.5 million poods, excluding legumes, 20 million poods as a guarantee, i.e. in reserve, and 10 million poods carried over, in total 61.5 million poods. On October 20th, 1932, the PB adopted a decision to reduce the export from the 1932 harvest from 165 to 150 million tons. End quote. Lee, Letters to Molotov, is a translation from the Russian original, which we reproduce and discuss below. 3. Forced collectivization resulted in widespread famine. Before proceeding, we should note that this sentence, forced collectivization resulted in widespread famine, is in addition by the editors who assume this rather than trying to prove it. As we have shown, neither Davies and Wheatcroft nor Tauger think this is true. Lee's text continues, quote, On 17 June 1932, the Ukrainian Politburo sent Kaganovich and Molotov the following telegram. On the instructions of our Central Committee, Chubar has initiated a request to grant food assistance to Ukraine for districts experiencing a state of emergency. We urgently request additional means for processing sugar beets and also supplemental aid, in addition to the 220,000 and other 600,000 pounds of bread. In Stalin's view, Ukrainian crop failures were caused by enemy resistance and by the poor leadership of Ukrainian officials. On June 21, 1932, the Central Committee sent a telegram signed by Stalin and Molotov to the Ukrainian Central Committee and Council of Commissars proposing to ensure the collection of grain at all costs. The telegram stated, "No manner of deviation regarding either amounts or deadlines set for grain deliveries can be permitted from the plan established for your region, and for collecting grain from collective and private farms, or for delivering grain to state farms." On June 23, 1932, in response to S.V. Kosiar's telegram requesting aid, the Politburo passed the following resolution: to restrict ourselves to the decisions already adopted by the Central Committee and not to approve the shipment of additional grain into Ukraine. All quotations are from the 1932 to 1933 Ukrainian famine in the eyes of historians and in the language of documents in Ukrainian, Kiev, 1990, pages 183, 186, 187, and 190. End quote. The original document reads as follows. Number 144, Decree of Politburo of the CCVCPB. Central Committee of the All-Russian Communist Party Bolsheviks, the formal name for the party until October 1952, concerning foodstuff aid to the Ukrainian SSR of June 16, 1932. The title is in Ukrainian, the text in Russian. A. To release to the Ukraine 2,000 tons of oats for food needs from the unused seed reserves. B. To release to the Ukraine 100,000 poods of corn for food of that released for sowing for the Odessa Oblast but not used for that purpose. C. To release 70,000 poods of grain for sugar beet Soviet farms of the Ukrainian SSR for food needs. D. To release 230,000 poods of grain for collective farms in the sugar beet regions of the Ukrainian SSR for food needs. E. To require Comrade Chubar to personally verify the fulfillment of the released grain for the sugar beet Soviet and collective farms, that it be used strictly for this purpose. F. To release 25,000 poods of grain for the sugar beet Soviet farms of the Central Black Earth region for food needs in connection with the gathering of the harvest, first requiring Comrade Veryekis to personally verify that the grain released is used for the assigned purpose. G. By the present decision to consider the question of food aid to sugar beet producing Soviet and collective farms closed. So, it is true that Stalin rejected the June 17th request of the Ukrainian Party's Politburo for more food aid, but what Snyder, as well as the editors of the Stalin-Molotov correspondence, did not disclose to their readers is that 1 day earlier, on June 16th, Stalin et al. Had ordered a very large quantity of food grains to the Ukraine. It is crucial to Snyder's thesis to claim or imply that the Soviet government did not send food aid to the Ukraine. Quote, deliberate starvation of Ukraine, end quote, the Holodomor, is incompatible with serious attempts by the Soviet state to alleviate the famine. But that is what happened. Here is a passage from a 1991 article by Mark Tauger. Quote, the harvest decline also decreased the regime's reserves of grain for export. This drop in reserves began with the drought-reduced 1931 harvest and subsequent procurements, which brought famine to the Volga region, Siberia, and other areas. Soviet leaders were forced to return procured grain to those areas in 1932. The low 1931 harvest and reallocations of grain to famine areas forced the regime to curtail grain exports from 5.2 million tons in 1931 to 1.73 million in 1932. They declined to 1.68 million in 1933. Grain exported in 1932 and 1933 could have fed many people and reduced the famine. The 354,000 tons exported during the first half of 1933, for example, could have provided nearly 2 million people with daily rations of 1 kilogram for 6 months. Yet these exports were less than half of the 750,000 tons exported in the first half of 1932. How Soviet leaders calculated the relative costs of lower exports and lower domestic food supplies remains uncertain, but available evidence indicates that further reductions or cessation of Soviet exports could have had serious consequences. Grain prices fell in world markets and turned the terms of trade against the Soviet Union. In the early 1930s, its indebtedness rose and its potential ability to pay declined, causing Western bankers and officials to consider seizure of Soviet property abroad and denial of future credits in case of Soviet default. Failure to export thus would have threatened the fulfillment of its industrialization plans and, according to some observers, the stability of the regime. While the leadership did not stop exports, they did try to alleviate the famine. A 25th of February 1933 Central Committee decree allotted seed loans of 320,000 tons to Ukraine and 240,000 tons to the Northern Caucasus. Seed loans were also made to the Lower Volga and may have been made to other regions as well. Kolchutsky cites Ukrainian party archives, showing that total aid to Ukraine by April 1933 actually exceeded 560,000 tons, including more than 80,000 tons of food. Aid to Ukraine alone was 60% greater than the amount exported during the same period. Total aid to famine regions was more than double exports for the first half of 1933. It appears to have been another consequence of the low 1932 harvest that more aid was not provided after the low 1931, 1934, and 1936 harvests. Procured grain was transferred back to peasants at the expense of exports. The low 1932 harvest meant that the regime did not have sufficient grain for urban and rural food supplies, seed, and exports. The authorities curtailed all of these, but ultimately rural food supplies had lost priority. The harsh 1932 to 1933 procurements only displaced the famine from urban areas, which would have suffered a similar scale of mortality without the grain procurements provided. Though, as noted above, urban mortality rates also rose in 1933. The severity and geographical extent of the famine, the sharp decline in exports in 1932 to 1933, seed requirements, and the chaos in the Soviet Union in these years all lead to the conclusion that even a complete cessation of exports would not have been enough to prevent the famine. This situation makes it difficult to accept the interpretation of the famine as the result of the 1932 grain procurements and as a conscious act of genocide. The harvest of 1932 essentially made a famine inevitable. End quote. For our present purposes, Tauger's heavily documented account shows that 1. The Soviet Politburo did provide a great deal of aid both in seed grain and in food to the Ukraine. 2. Stopping all exports would have seriously harmed, perhaps destroyed, Soviet foreign credit and either seriously delayed industrialization or caused it to fail altogether. In a footnote, Tauger provides evidence from British archives that Soviet failure to meet its export obligations would have brought disaster, a refusal of future credits, seizure of Soviet assets abroad, and so probably the failure of the industrialization program. But it was industrialization that, together with collectivization, broke the 1,000-year cycle of famines in Russia. Industrialization was essential to preventing further famines, as well as to industrialization of other areas of the economy and the modernization of the military. 3. Tauger concludes that even a complete cessation of exports would not have been enough to prevent famine. Davies and Wheatcroft outlined the deepening crisis after the spring of 1932, along with the extensive aid in both seed grain and food granted by the authorities to the affected areas, including to the Ukraine. They document how hunger weakened the farmers and led to late sowing and poor weeding, which further lessened the harvest. Armed with more accurate weather information, they conclude that the weather in 1932 was much more unfavorable than we had previously realized. The state made advances to collective farmers in order to bring in the harvest, as we noted in the last chapter. The best research on the environmental causes of the famine is by Tauger. the Soviet authorities greatly overestimated the crop that would be harvested in late 1932, but so did foreign experts, as Davies and Wheatcroft show. Hunger limited the strength of harvest workers. Plant diseases were a serious problem. According to Davies and Wheatcroft, quote, during the harvest of 1932, the poor weather, the lack of autumn and spring plowing, the shortage and poor quality of the seed, the poor cultivation of the crop, and the delay in harvesting all combined to increase the incidence of fungal disease. Reports in the People's Commissariat for Agricultural Archives complain that traditional campaigns to disinfect the fields, the storehouses, and the sacks for the harvested grain were all carried out extremely badly in Ukraine. Carnes, the British expert whose overestimation of the 1932 harvest they cited earlier, found that in the North Caucasus the winter wheat was extremely weedy and looked as though it was badly rusted, and all the spring wheat I saw was simply rotten with rust. End quote. Conclusion. In June 1932, the authorities were still looking forward to a good harvest. A few pages earlier, Davies and Wheatcroft quote the opinion of one of the foreign experts. Quote, Andrew Carnes, the Scottish grain specialist, traveled extensively in the major grain regions in May and July 1932, reporting very bad conditions, and dismissed the official estimate that the yield would be 7.8 centeners as absurdly too high. He nevertheless concluded in a cable, do not like to generalize about comparative size this and last year's harvest, tentatively of opinion this year's appreciably larger. Stop. End quote. Snyder conceals these facts from his readers. The result of his doing so is to suggest that the famine could have been averted through different policies, but that Stalin and the Politburo refused to do so. This is false. Snyder conceals the fact that Stalin et al. Shipped large quantities of food grains to the Ukraine in June 1932. This fact alone is fatal to his deliberate starvation thesis. One does not ship food to those whom one wishes to starve. Stalin's First Commandment. Another Snyder fabrication. Snyder. Understanding this religiosity, party activists propagated what they called Stalin's First Commandment. The collective farm supplies, first the state, and only then the people. As the peasants would have known, the First Commandment in its biblical form reads, Thou shalt have no other God before me. Page 29. Sources note 20, page 464. For the Stalinist First Commandment, see Koldzicki, Holodomor, page 170. See also Kuzner's Ukrania 70. Here Snyder seems to be trying to deliberately deceive his readers. For why was the state collecting produce from collective farms? Naturally, for the non-agricultural areas and for export. The workers in the cities and towns could not grow their own food. Contracts for exports had been made a year earlier. In the mid-1932, the fact that there was going to be a widespread famine was of course not known to anyone. Koldzicki, Holodomor, page 170. The First Commandment. The former seminarian, Joseph Stalin, sometimes uses phrases borrowed from the Bible. Thanks to the propaganda apparatus, the expression the First Commandment gained great circulation. It was addressed to the peasants, and it meant that the collective farm should first settle with the state, and then divide the remaining crop on the basis of mandates among the employees. The deficit of bread in the country was caused, as we have seen, by the supply required for the state. Kuzner's Ukrania 70. This is a phony citation. There is nothing in Kuzner's book about the First Commandment or the OGPU using religious language. On the contrary, Kuzner's records the recollection that some kulaks dressed up as devils and informed superstitious peasants that entering the collective farm was a pact with the devil, and that the OGPU arrested 3 of them and sentenced them to prison. Conclusion: Snyder is untruthful here. Judging from the very sources he cites, the term the First Commandment was invented by Koldzicki as a section heading. Koldzicki does claim That somebody, either the party propagandists or the peasants, called the grain collection plan by this name, but he cites no evidence that anybody used this term, much less that it was well known. Snyder claims that Stalin's own policy of collectivization could cause mass starvation was also clear, page 35, his evidence note 35, page 465, Cameron, Hungry Steppe, chapter 2, Pianosiola, Collectivization Famine, 103 to 112, Mark, Hungersnot, 119, chapter 2 of Cameron, Hungry Steppe, a 2010 Yale PhD dissertation, contains nothing that supports Snyder's claim that collectivization could cause mass starvation, much less that this was clear. Pianosiola, The Collectivization Famine in Kazakhstan, was published in Harvard Ukrainian Studies 25, 2001. It contains no evidence that collectivization could cause mass starvation, much less of deliberate starvation. Mark Hungersnot does not appear in Snyder's bibliography. The following article is most certainly the one meant. Rudolf A. Mark, Gerhard Simon. Die Hungersnot in der Ukraine und anderen Regionen der USSR, 1932 und 1933, Ustropa 54, 2004, S. 5 to 12. This article is a long series of undocumented assertions reflecting the Ukrainian nationalist viewpoint that Snyder also echoes. It contains no evidence to support its assertion, which is also Snyder's, that the famine was caused by collectivization, much less that this was predictable from the outset, as Snyder claims. Davis and Wheatcroft discuss the Kazakhstan famine, 322 to 326 and 408 to 409. This basic work is also cited by Cameron and Pianosiola. They conclude that there was a population deficit by 1939 of some 1.2 million. This is an estimate based on a projection of what the Kazakh population of Kazakhstan would have been if 1. Its natural increase of 1926 had continued through to January 1939, that is, if there had been no famines in 1928 and 1932 to 1933, and B. all Kazakhs had remained in Kazakhstan during this entire period. Davies and Wheatcroft cite evidence that large numbers of Kazakhs migrated to other regions in Kazakhstan and to other regions and republics in search of a livelihood, or simply seeking food, while others immigrated to China. For these reasons, we cannot know precisely how many Kazakhs died of famine, i.e. the surplus of deaths during the famine years. None of these sources establish that collectivization was the cause of mass starvation. Snyder is guilty of the logical fallacy of begging the question, asserting that which ought to be proven. More false citations. Stalin's personal politics, starving peasants on tour. Quote, Stalin, a master of personal politics, presented the Ukrainian famine in personal terms. His first impulse and his lasting tendency was to see the starvation of Ukrainian peasants as a betrayal by members of the Ukrainian Communist Party. He could not allow the possibility that his own policy of collectivization was to blame. The problem must be in the implementation, in the local leaders, anywhere but in the concept itself, as he pushed forward with his transformation in the first half of 1932. End quote. This paragraph is really Snyder's own imagination. Snyder declares that he has determined what Stalin intended, what Stalin's first impulse was, what Stalin could not allow, what problems he saw. How can he possibly know these things? Therefore, it is both nonsense and a deception. This passage concerns the first half of 1932. As the discussion above has pointed out, the famine had not yet made itself clear in early 1932. At that time, Stalin wrote that he believed the incipient hunger were the result of mismanagement. Quote, starving Ukrainian peasants, he complained, were leaving their home republic and demoralizing other Soviet citizens by their whining. End quote. Sources, note 36, page 465, quotations, Davies, Kaganovich Correspondence 138, on Stalin's predisposition to personalized politics, Kulzicki, Holodomor 180, Kuzner's Ukrainia 152. Traveling peasants were whining, just not starving. There are a few factual statements that we can check, such as the statement about whining. Davies, Kaganovich Correspondence 138. The relevant part of Stalin's letter to Kaganovich of June 18, 1932, reads thus, The results of these mistakes can now be seen in the matter of sowing, especially in the Ukraine, in that several tens of thousands of Ukrainian collective farmers are still traveling all around the European part of the USSR and are degrading the collective farms for us by their complaints and whining. So, Snyder is correct that Stalin accused the kolkhozniks of whining, but these peasants could not possibly have been starving as Snyder claims, and he cites no evidence that they were. Train travel costs money which starving people would spend on food, not travel. Likewise, moneyless, starving people would not have the strength to travel all over the European part of the USSR. They would need food to have the energy to travel anywhere. If these farmers were not starving, what were they doing? Most likely, they were traveling to trade, either taking grain from the Ukraine to trade for other things, the harvest was bad in European Russia too, or taking money or other goods to trade for grain. In normal times, this activity was not immoral or illegal, but during a famine the price of food increases greatly. The Soviet government's efforts to distribute food according to need rather than according to who had the money to buy it as inflated prices stood in complete contradiction to permitting speculators to travel around buying and selling grain. A capitalist approach to the famine would mean that, as usual, the well-off would eat and the poor would starve. The Bolsheviks needed to stop any trade in grain, because that would destroy all attempts to ration grain, reserving grain only for those who could pay for it with money or goods. Kolzicki, Holodomor, 180. This is a phony citation. There is nothing on this page about any predisposition to personal politics, whatever that might mean on Stalin's part. Stalin is not even mentioned on this page or on the pages before and after it, 179 or 181. Incidentally, this is a Polish translation of a Ukrainian language book. What is the point of using it as a secondary source? It is very hard to find. Snyder cites Ukrainian language works elsewhere, so why not here? Moreover, how could it contain any information about Stalin's predispositions that isn't available elsewhere? It is absurd to do what Snyder does, to write about Soviet history from Polish, Ukrainian, German, and English books and articles, while failing to use Russian works. From this and other indications in Bloodlands, it appears that Snyder can read Polish well enough. Perhaps he reads Ukrainian too. Perhaps Snyder cannot read Russian, at least not well. Or why wouldn't he use Russian primary and secondary sources for Soviet history instead of Polish and even Ukrainian translations? Or perhaps Snyder has nationalist Polish and Ukrainian historians helping him, but not Russian scholars? Kuzner's Ukrainia 152 is another phony citation. There is nothing about Stalin's supposed predisposition to personalized politics here. In fact, Stalin's name does not occur on page 152 of Kuzner's book. Stalin is briefly mentioned on page 148, a report was sent to Stalin, and not again until page 174. Did Molotov and Kaganovich explain starvation as laziness? Snyder claims that in July 1932, Molotov and Kaganovich told Ukrainian comrades that talk of starvation was just an excuse for laziness on the part of peasants who did not wish to work and activists who did not wish to discipline them and requisition grain. His evidence, note 40, page 465, on talk of starvation as an excuse for laziness, see Sapovol Lugin 135. This is another phony citation. Sapovol Lugin says nothing of the kind anywhere in this article, let alone on this specific page. The only statement even close to this is, quote, "In the Kremlin they were convinced that the plan for grain collection was realistic, and the leaders of the Ukraine just wanted to make their lives easier by their requests." End quote. Shapovalov's note to this passage is not a reference to any evidence. Rather, it is to yet another secondary source, an entire article by Shapovalov himself. In a hard-to-find collection of articles, co-edited by Shapovalov and Vasiliev in Kiev in 2001, I obtained the book, written partly in Russian and partly in Ukrainian, and have studied the article. Evidently, Snyder did not. Had he done so, he would have, or at any rate should have, footnoted it instead of Lugin. In any case, nothing in this article either corresponds to Snyder's claim of talk of starvation as an excuse for laziness, as he has done many times in this book. Snyder has falsely documented this fact claim, too, with citations which do not, in fact, document it. Were women routinely raped, robbed of food? Snyder asserts, quote, Women who lived alone were routinely raped at night under the pretext of grain confiscations, and their food was indeed taken from them after their bodies had been violated. This was the triumph of Stalin's law and Stalin's state." End quote. Source, note 48, page 465. On the party activists' abuses, see Kuzner's Ukrania 144-145, 118-119, and Kurumaya, Freedom and Terror 170-171. Kuzner's 144-145. The relevant sentences are as follows. Quote, "There were also examples of rapes of women. Members of the Committee on Grain Collection in Wisniki village, after alcoholic libations in a peasant's house, in turn raped his daughter, and later one of them, for about half an hour, held the naked girl in the cold." End quote. Kuzner's mentions this example at page 145. This was a crime, and Kuzner's cites an archival document. It would be useful to know what kind of document this is. It might be a record of a party report or even of a prosecution of the offender. Rape, which is undoubtedly among the most deplorable forms of victimization, occurs in a variety of settings and conditions and is not unique to those discussed in the present narrative. No doubt that the alleged intoxication of male authorities might exacerbate these conditions as well. As such, the question of whether this crime was punished is an important one. Source criticism is a fundamental part of the historical method, but Kuzner's makes no attempt to describe, much less to analyze, this archival source. On page 117 to 118, not 118 to 119, Kuzner's writes, quote, "During grain collection in 1932 in the village of Sursko, Majlowaka, Dnipropetrovsk district, the Komsomol secretary, Kontinko, raped women and took part in the beating of peasants." End quote. Kuzner's source is an article in Ukrainian by V.I. Berlutsky. Youth in the Socio-Political Life of the USSR, 1928 to 1933, in the Ukrainian Historical Journal for 2002. The source cited by Berlutsky is a report by the Odessa District Committee of the Komsomol to Andreev, head of the Ukrainian Komsomol. The citation is as follows, quote, "Thus, in the village of Sursaka Milovaksky, Solansky Rayon, Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, secretary of the Komsomol cell, Kontinko participated in raping women and beating peasants, for which he was sentenced to up to 3 years." End quote. The Odessa District Party Committee was reporting a crime committed by a Komsomol member for which the guilty man was tried, convicted, and sentenced to up to 3 years. Neither Kuzner nor Snyder mentions this fact. It would be important to have the document from which Berlutsky is quoting, evidently a trial transcript or sentence, but he does not provide it. Conclusion: there is no evidence that rape was routine, as Snyder claims. Moreover, neither of these examples, the only two examples given in the works he cites, concern women living alone, the pretext of grain confiscations or food taken from them after the rape, etc. Stalin's new malice. Snyder, quote, "The next day Stalin approached the problem of the famine with a new degree of malice. 2 Politburo telegrams sent out on the 8th of November 1932 reflected the mood. Individual and collective farmers in the Soviet Ukraine who failed to meet requisition targets were to be denied access to products from the rest of the economy. A special troika was created in Ukraine to hasten the sentencing and execution of party activists and peasants who supposedly were responsible for sabotage. Some 1,623 Kolkhoz officials were arrested that month. Deportations within Ukraine were resumed. 30,400 more people were gone by the end of the year. The activists told the peasants, open up or we'll knock down the door, we'll take what you have, and you'll die in a camp." End quote. Sources, note 51, page 465, quotation, Kovalenko, Holod, page 44. The 2 Politburo telegrams, Marachko, Holodomor, 152, and Davies years, 174. The 1,623 arrested Kolkhoz officials, Davies years, 174. For 30,400 resumed deportations, Kuzner's Ukrania, 59. Kovalenko, Holod, 44. The quotation is actually on page 45. It is the recollection of a child of a Kulak family. A 1927 photo of the family is also on page 45. After a certain time, the team appeared near our house. They tore down the door and drummed on the window panes so that they were about to shatter. I still have not forgotten their threat. Open up or we'll knock down the door. We will take away what we want and you will die in jail. Snyder's claim that the activists told the peasants, in a general sense, but this is false. The account in question is a single incident. Moreover, the activists had good reason to threaten this peasant. In another part of the same account, not quoted by Snyder, the author describes how his family did in fact hide wheat, potatoes, and other beets in 2 holes, in case one was found. The authorities had the obligation to collect any food over and above a minimal amount for the peasant family's own survival in order to distribute it to the others who were starving to death. In fact, the peasants were obliged to do this, hence the threat of prison. Petro Danilovich Gumenyuk, the person whose account this is, born in 1923, would have been 8 or 9 at this time. No year is given. He went on to become a doctor of economics and professor at Ternopil Institute of Finance and Economics. His membership in a prosperous peasant family did not prevent him from having a fine career in the USSR, and his family did not starve. Davies, years 174, states, on November 8th, Stalin and Molotov insisted in a telegram to Kosiar that from today the dispatch of goods for the villages of all regions of Ukraine shall cease until kolkhozy and individual peasants begin honestly and conscientiously to fulfill their duty to the working class and the Red Army for the delivery of grain. Davis, indeed, does report on the Special Commission of 3, or Troika, to simplify further the procedure for confirming death sentences in Ukraine. This is another of the few accurate claims Snyder makes in this book. Another is Stalin's remark about whining kolkhozniks above. The 1,623 kolkhoz officials, plus others arrested for counter-revolutionary offenses, are also mentioned in a document of December 9th. Davies, but not Snyder, informs us that over 2,000 of those arrested were allegedly former supporters of Petluria, or Makhno, that is, former anti-Soviet rebels. It appears that none of these documents have been published in any of the great collection of documents concerning the famine. Snyder has certainly not seen them. Morochko, Holodomor 152, first telegram. Morochko says that this is from Stalin to Katayevich. Responding to his coded message about the delivery of goods to Ukraine, Stalin said that the CPSU-B was discussing the issue of banning delivery of goods to the Ukrainian village until the Ukraine frankly and accurately fulfills the reduced grain procurement plan. It would be good to have the text of the telegram, but Morochko does not give it. Even his quotations from it are in Ukrainian, not Russian. Second telegram, Morochko says this is from Molotov and Stalin to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Ukraine. It is reported that on November 8th, shipment is suspended of goods to villages in all regions of Ukraine, as long as kolkhozes and individual farmers do not start to honestly and faithfully perform their duty towards the working class and the Red Army in the case of grain procurement. Morochko does not identify the actual text of this telegram either. Both these telegrams would certainly have been in Russian. On the 30,400 resumed deportations, see Kuzner's Ukrainia 59. Here is the relevant text in Kuzner's book. Dekukalization and deportation also took place at a later date. On the 29th of March, 1932, the Political Bureau of the Central Committee of the KPBU, a secret deportation order, approved the deportation of 5,000 kulak families from Police to the left bank of the Dnieper in order to use them to work in the quarries. For the exiles, there have been established permanent kulak settlements there. In the period between 28 November and 25th December 1932, more than 30,400 persons were exiled to the north of the USSR. Kuzner's footnotes are 2 archival documents which we cannot obtain and check. However, the authoritative 2005 volume Stalinitsky Deportatsy 1928 to 1953 Documenti records no such deportations during any period of 1932, much less the last 6 months. Conclusion, Morochko does not quote the original text of Stalin's 2 telegrams, as Snyder's reference suggests. Therefore, Snyder has not seen the texts either. According to what Morochko does cite, it appears that if collective farms and individual farmers were to begin honestly and conscientiously to fulfill their duty, they would not be denied products from the rest of the economy. The telegram quoted by Davies and by Morochko does not state that a farm or peasant had to completely fulfill their grain delivery quota, only that they had to make an honest and conscientious attempt. It is difficult to find any fault with this regulation, much less to discern in it any degree of malice at all. If farms and peasants had money to buy, or agricultural produce to exchange for manufactured products, then they were obligated to do their best to pay their taxes, for that's what grain deliveries were. Nothing in the paragraph supports Snyder's hypothesis of a deliberate famine. Did Stalin call the famine a fairy tale? Snyder says that at the end of 1932, Stalin came to believe that the famine was a fairy tale, a slanderous rumor spread by enemies. His source, note 52, page 465, Sapoval Lugin 159, and Davies Years 199. Sapoval Lugin 159, this page does not exist. Evidently, Snyder means 139, where the same quotation is given as is given in Davies' Years 199. The quotation is from Pravda, May 26, 1964. Davies, but not Shapoval or Snyder, states, "It is not clear whether this statement comes from the archives, from memoirs, or from hearsay. Either Terokov, the man who supposedly made this statement, claims Stalin said this to him, or Stalin really did say this to him, or the whole matter is a fabrication. This is quite possible, as Khrushchev and his men were fabricating, deliberately falsifying, and lying a great deal about Stalin and the Stalin years. We already know, and Snyder has acknowledged, that Stalin knew there was a famine in the Ukraine and elsewhere, therefore it seems unlikely that Stalin would have used the term fairy tale about hunger." According to the Pravda article, R.A. Terekov and the Kharkov first secretary told this story orally. Evidently in 1964, the Russian famine scholar Viktor Kondrashin states that Stalin said or wrote these words to Terekov on February 22, 1932. However, according to a newspaper source, Terekov R.A. was removed from the post of first secretary of the Kharkov Oblast and city committees on January 29, 1933. Viktor Danilov states that this exchange with Stalin took place at the end of 1932, and Terekov was removed from office by decree of the Central Committee of the VKBB of January 24, 1933. None of this tells us whether Stalin actually said these words to Terekov or why, but it seems clear that either the story is untrue, a rumor, which would account for the disagreement about when it happened, or it was a minor flare-up on Stalin's part. Terekov moved from party to government and production work, where he remained until his retirement in 1956. Terekov attended the 22nd Party Congress in October 1961, during which Khrushchev was at his most ferocious and utterly mendacious attacks on Stalin, but apparently did not speak at the Congress. Perhaps Shapolov took this story from the 1974 Russian language edition, New York Nov, of Roy Medvedev's book Let History Judge, where it occurs on page 213. Medvedev's book is the source of many rumors about Soviet history that have been passed on as fact. As to the rest of the quotation, Snyder again begs the question by assuming that which should be proven, namely, that collectivization caused the famine. Amazingly enough, though Snyder's whole thesis of Soviet mass murder is largely predicated upon this statement, he never tries to prove it or provides any evidence at all that this is so. As we have already shown, it cannot be proven because it is false. Famines had occurred every 2 to 4 years in Russia and Ukraine for at least a millennium, nor does Snyder give any evidence at all for his claim that, quote, Stalin had developed an interesting new theory that resistance to socialism increases as its successes mount, because its foes resist with greater desperation as they contemplate their final defeat. Thus, any problem in the Soviet Union could be defined as an example of enemy action, and enemy action could be defined as evidence of progress. End quote. But even in this Pravda version, Stalin does not refer to enemies, as Snyder claims. Therefore, this is pure fabrication on Snyder's part, unless it is an oblique reference to one of the accusations Khrushchev made against Stalin in his famous secret speech to the 20th Party Congress in February 1956. The present author has fully exposed Khrushchev's falsehoods in this speech in an earlier book. Did Stalin believe that starvation was resistance? Snyder makes the following claim, quote, resistance to his policies in Soviet Ukraine, Stalin argued, was of a special sort, perhaps not visible to the imperceptive observer. Opposition was no longer open, for the enemies of socialism were now quiet and even holy. The kulaks of today, he said, were gentle people, kind, almost saintly. End quote. His sources, note 53, page 465, quotations, Ukrainia 124, see also Vasilev Tsina, page 60, Kuromaya, Stalin 110. Here we have 3 citations to Kerzner's, Vasilev, and Kuromaya, but in reality they all refer to the very same document. Moreover, it is a document that has been available in English for 60 years and can be easily found on the internet today. Kuzner's Ukrania 124 quotes from the well-known speech of Stalin's of January 1st, 1933. This speech was published in 1950 in Volume 13 of Stalin's collected works and has been available in English, to say nothing of Russian, for more than 60 years. It is on the internet in Russian and English. The fact that Snyder quotes this document from a Polish-language book once again suggests that either Snyder does not read even the most basic texts in Russian or that he is not interested in helping his readers find the sources. In this speech, Stalin was ironic in calling the kulaks of today gentle, kind, almost saintly. The context shows this. Quote, "People look for the class enemy outside the collective farms. They look for persons with ferocious visages, with enormous teeth and thick necks, and with sawn-off shotguns in their hands. They look for kulaks like those depicted on our posters, but such kulaks have long ceased to exist on the surface. The present-day kulaks and kulak agents, the present-day anti-Soviet elements in the countryside are in the main quiet, smooth-spoken, almost saintly people. There is no need to look for them far from the collective farms. They are inside the collective farms, occupying posts as storekeepers, managers, accountants, secretaries, etc. They will never say down with the collective farms. They are in favor of collective farms. But inside the collective farms, they carry on sabotage and wrecking work that certainly does the collective farms no good. They will never say, down with grain procurements. They are in favor of grain procurements. They only resort to demagogy and demand that the collective farm should reserve a fund for the needs of livestock raising 3 times as large as that actually required. That the collective farm should set aside an insurance fund 3 times as large as that actually acquired. That the collective farm should provide from 6 to 10 pounds of bread per working member per day for public catering, etc. Of course, after such funds have been formed and such grants for public catering made, after such rascally demagogy, the economic strength of the collective farms is bound to be undermined, and there is little left for grain procurements." End quote. Vasilev, Tsina, 60. Vasilev summarizes this same speech on pages 59-61, but in Ukrainian it adds nothing by way of commentary. Kuramaya Stalin 110. This is simply 2 quotations from Stalin's January 1933 report to the Joint Plenum of the Central Committee and the Central Control Committee. This speech is the fuller version of the talk work in the countryside quoted above. It is identical to the first citation in this note. Snyder's citation of a document in a Polish and a Ukrainian source of a document readily available in English as well as in the original Russian can have no purpose except to impress his readers with this show of scholarship. Readers of Bloodlands will have no idea that he is doing this. They will think that Kuzner's and Vasilev actually have something to add, nor is there any need here for the Kuramaya citation when the primary source itself is available on the internet. Starvation was resistance. Another Snyder fabrication. There is no evidence whatsoever for the following statements made by Snyder here, who merely relies on the same footnote 53 as discussed above. Quote, "People who appeared to be innocent were to be seen as guilty. A peasant slowly dying of hunger was, despite appearances, a saboteur working for the capitalist powers in their campaign to discredit the Soviet Union. Starvation was resistance, and resistance was a sign that the victory of socialism was just around the corner. These were not merely Stalin's musings in Moscow. This was the ideological line enforced by Molotov and Kaganovich as they traveled through regions of mass death in late 1932. End quote. Snyder has simply invented all this. Few readers of Bloodlands will realize that it is a pure fabrication of Snyder's own, and that, no doubt, is why Snyder inserted it. Snyder, quote, "Forced to interpret distended bellies as political opposition, they, Stalin's comrades in the Soviet Union, produced the utterly tortured conclusion that the saboteurs hated socialism so much that they intentionally let their families die. Thus the racked bodies of sons and daughters and fathers and mothers were nothing more than a facade behind which foes plotted the destruction of socialism." End quote. Sources. On the family interpretation, Stanislaw Kosiar, C. Davies, Years, 206. Snyder's statement is false, a fabrication. Kosiar said nothing about hatred of socialism or any tortured conclusions. Davies, quoted below at the reference Snyder gives, accurately summarizes Kosiar's statement. We would add that Kosior gave only 2 examples, and only the first was of a farmer who let his children go hungry while keeping grain. Kosior does not give the age of the farmer's children, whom he cast out. For all we know, they could have been adults. Davies' years, 206. Quote, and on February 9th, Kosior circulated a report to the Ukrainian Politburo listing cases where he claimed malicious withholders of grain have brought their families to real hunger. The children swell up, even though they possessed several centenars of grain. End quote. In Davies' Years Bibliography, page 526, the full title of this book is given. The text in the original Ukrainian from this source is as follows. Some of the RPK reported that in the fight against grain procurements, malicious withholders of grain bring their families to real hunger. The children swell up. Brigadier Govsky, RPK, Kharkov region, writes on February 1st, in the Vasevsky village hall, the contractor of Group 3, Yakovets Vlas, with 4.45 hectares of crops, contracting 27.8 centenars, did not give a single pound of bread, but cast his children out, and they now live by begging. The team for grain procurement found at his place, buried in pits, 5 centenars, 2.35 centenars, 5.23 centenars, and 6.42 centenars. The Yakimovsky RPK gives a similar report. Collective farmer Klemenko of the Molotov Artel shouted, "I'm hungry and my children are swelling up." After verification, 2.5 centenars of grain were found at his place, although he had received only 90 kg in workday pay. RPK equals Regional Society of Consumer Cooperatives. Conclusions. Snyder's fabrications here are as follows. There is no evidence that Stalin was forced to interpret distended bellies as political opposition. There is nothing here about intentionally letting their families die. There is nothing about the racked bodies of sons and daughters and fathers and mothers were nothing more than a facade behind which foes plotted the destruction of socialism. Yet these are the statements for which Snyder cites the Davies passage as evidence. Davies cites Kosior, whose actual statement we have reproduced above. It could hardly be clearer that Snyder has invented all this. Should Stalin have predicted the future? Snyder, quote, "Yet Stalin might have saved millions of lives without drawing any outside attention to the Soviet Union. He could have suspended food exports for a few months, released grain reserves, 3 million tons, or just given peasants access to local grain storage areas. Such simple measures, pursued as late as November 1932, could have kept the death toll to the hundreds of thousands rather than the millions. Stalin pursued none of them." His sources. Note, 55, page 466. For similar judgments, see, for example, Jan Holodomor, Davies, Tauger, and Wheatcroft, Grain Stocks, Galutsky, Holodomor, Grozowski, New Interpretation, end quote. Han Holodomor, page 25, cites no evidence for any of the claims on this page. One might object that Snyder simply claims he makes similar judgments, but judgments are of no validity without evidence. Like Snyder himself, Jan has none. Jan's article is in the ideologically anti-communist journal Oystropa. It is a statement of his anti-communist beliefs, not a scholarly study of the famine or of anything else. Jan also claims that there was no natural famine caused by environmental reasons or even from insufficient food production, but solely from deliberate withdrawal of foodstuffs. Jan even doubts whether the government was aware of the starvation. None of the specialists on the famine, like Davies and Wheatcroft or Tauger, conclude anything like this. Davies, Tauger, and Wheatcroft grain stocks, page 657. In Snyder's list of references, the only specialists on the famine with any claim to objectivity are Davies, Tauger, and Wheatcroft. Here is what they have to say. Quote, "We therefore conclude, 1. All planners' stocks, the 2 secret grain reserves, NEP Fund and Mob Fund or Goss Fund, together with transitional stocks held by grain organizations, amounted on 1st July 1933 to less than 2 million tons, 1.997 million tons according to the highest official figure. Persistent efforts of Stalin and the Politburo to establish firm and inviolable grain reserves, in addition to transitional stocks, amounted to 2 or 3 million tons more, were almost completely unsuccessful. In both January through June 1932 and January through June 1933, the Politburo had to allow untouchable grain stocks set aside at the beginning of each year to be used to meet food and fodder crises. On the 1st of July 1933, the total amount of grain set aside in reserve grain stocks, Foundy, amounted not to 4.53 million tons as Conquest claimed, but to only 1.141 million. It is not surprising that after years during which the Politburo had failed to establish inviolable grain stocks, Khrushchev in early 1933 recommended a flexible approach to Nepfond and Mobfond, denied that they were separate reserves, and even claimed that the flexible use of the two fondi had enabled uninterrupted grain supply in spring and summer 1932. End quote. In the quotation above, Snyder claims, without any reference, that the USSR held 3 million tons of grain in reserve as late as November 1932, but here Davies and Wheatcroft claim that A, the grain reserves were likely less than 2 million tons, B, that in the first half of 1932 and again in the first half of 1933, the Politburo had to allow untouchable grain stocks set aside at the beginning of each year to be used to meet food and fodder crises. That is, the Politburo did, in fact, release grain reserves to alleviate the famine. Davies and Wheatcroft continue. 2. We do not know the amount of grain which was held by grain-consuming organizations, notably the Red Army, but we suspect that these consumers' stocks would not change the picture substantially. 3. These findings do not, of course, free Stalin from responsibility for the famine. It is difficult, perhaps impossible, to assess the extent to which it would have been possible for Stalin to use part of the grain stocks available in spring 1933 to feed starving peasants. The state was a monopoly supplier of grain to urban areas, and the army, if the reserves of this monopoly supply system, which amounted to 4 6-week supplies, were to have been drained, mass starvation, epidemics, and unrest in the towns could have resulted. Nevertheless, it seems certain that if Stalin had risked lower levels of these reserves in spring and summer 1933, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of lives could have been saved. In the slightly longer term, if he had been open about the famine, some international help would certainly have alleviated the disaster. And if he had been more far-sighted, the agricultural crises of 1932 to 1933 could have been mitigated and perhaps even avoided altogether, but Stalin was not hoarding immense grain reserves in these years. On the contrary, he had failed to reach the levels which he had been imperatively demanding since 1929. Snyder claimed that Stalin could have kept the death toll to the hundreds of thousands rather than the millions. Davies, Togger, and Wheatcroft surmised that hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of lives could have been saved, but only by risking mass starvation, epidemics, and unrest in the towns. Mark Togger, as we have seen, goes further. Quote, the severity and geographical extent of the famine, the sharp decline in exports in 1932 to 1933, seed requirements, and the chaos in the Soviet Union in these years all lead to the conclusion that even a complete cessation of exports would not have been enough to prevent famine. End quote. However, both Snyder and Davies et al. Tacitly assumed that the Soviet leadership, Stalin, could have known in advance that the famine would end in 1933 with a good harvest. Of course, neither the Soviet leadership nor anyone could possibly know this. For all they or anyone knew, the famine would continue unabated during 1933. Since they could not know where the famine would end, the Soviet state retained grain stocks. Moreover, no government in the world would have deprived its army of foodstuffs. That was especially the case with the USSR, which was surrounded by hostile states. Nor would any government have deprived the cities of food reserves and risked mass starvation, epidemics, and unrest. A central aspect of the plan to end the cycle of starvation collectivization depended upon production of labor-saving farm machinery such as tractors and harvesters. These were produced in the cities. The USSR had received large-scale international aid during the Volga famine of 1921 to 1922 that followed the incredible destructiveness of the First World War and Civil War, the typhus epidemic, and very poor weather conditions. But there is no reason to think that significant international aid would have been forthcoming in the same way in 1933, the depths of the Great Depression. Davies, Tauger, and Wheatcroft do not give any evidence for this assertion. Glzicki, Holodomor, 237. In 1932, there were sent to foreign markets 107.9 million puds of grain, according to the balance of food and feed grains prepared by Ukraine Grain Center. To feed one person in the village were required 16 puds per year. This means that the grain exported in 1932 could have saved from death all who died of starvation in the Soviet Union in 1933. Here, Kulczycki, too, absurdly suggests that if only Stalin had known a year in advance that there would be a great famine in 1933, he ought to have not exported any grain in 1932. Gryzozzi, new interpretation, has no page 12 on page 108. The 12th page in the article, we do read similar judgments, in that Gryzozzi asserts that the famine was deliberate, but like Snyder, Gryzozzi fails to cite any evidence that this was the case. The simple assertion of Gryzozzi or of anyone is not evidence. We discuss Snyder's 7 points of proof, pages 42 through 46 in chapter 1 of this book. Begging the question again, assertions without evidence. Snyder, quote, "This final collection was murder, even if those who executed it very often believed that they were doing the right thing. As one activist remembered, that spring he saw people dying from hunger. I saw women and children with distended bellies, turning blue, still breathing, with vacant but lifeless eyes. Yet he saw all this and did not go out of my mind or commit suicide. He had faith. As before I believed, I wanted to believe. Other activists, no doubt, were less faithful and more fearful. Every level of the Ukrainian party had been purged in the previous year. In January 1933, Stalin sent in his own men to control its heights. Those communists who no longer expressed their faith formed a wall of silence that doomed those it surrounded. They had learned that to resist was to be purged, and though to be purged was to share the fate of those whose deaths they were now bringing about. Sources, note 67, page 466. For the Recollections of the Activist, Conquest Harvest, 233. For quotation and details on the importance of purges, Sapoval, Lugin, 133. On purges of the Heights, Davies, Years, 138. End quote. Snyder cites no evidence at all that this final collection was murder. Rather, this is yet another example of begging the question. He is supposed to prove murder, not merely assert it. The activist quoted by Conquest is Lev Kapelev, from his memoir published in 1980. The quotation only documents that people starved, a fact that no one denies. Snyder quotes this passage later in the book as well. In his old age, Kapelev came to believe that the famine was man-made, but he had no such doubts at the time. In Chapter 1 of the present book, we have quoted Robert Conquest's repudiation of his former position expressed in his book, The Harvest of Sorrow, 1986, that the famine was man-made. Snyder is aware of this too because he cites and therefore has read Davies and Wheatcroft, where Conquest's repudiation is published. Therefore, Snyder is simply concealing this information from his readers. Shapoval Lugin has no such quotation on page 133. He does mention arrests of heads of kolkhozes for sabotaging grain collections, but only up to January 1st, 1932, well before the famine. He states that 80% of ration secretaries were removed in the first half of 1932, but says nothing about any relation to the famine. But even these statements do not refer to any primary source evidence. Instead, Shapoval refers us to a book of his own that is hard to find in the U.S. Shapoval refers to page 160 of this book. This is a page of an article of his own, Shapoval's in Ukrainian. The very same text, the entire article, is also published in Russian immediately following the Ukrainian text. Ukrainian, page 160, corresponds to Russian, pages 173 to 174, and this page does contain interesting information. For instance, it reveals that the 1932 plan for grain collection from the Ukraine was officially reduced 3 times. Even then, it had been less than half fulfilled by November 1st, 1932. Delegates to the conference passed a resolution which was confirmed by the plenum of the CC of the CPBU on July 9, 1932, and by which, for unconditional fulfillment, the established grain collection plan for the Ukraine was accepted, 356 million poods from the peasant sector. This plan was thereafter reduced in size 3 times, and by November 1st, 1932, only 136 million poods of grain had been obtained from the peasant sector of the Ukraine. Shapoval's source for this statement is a 48-page pamphlet published in 1989 by Kulczycki. But it isn't likely that Shapoval invented it, since it does not tend to support his anti-communist and Holodomor bias. Why would Stalin at all reduce the plan for grain collection from the Ukraine if their aim was to starve Ukrainians? In a later work, Kulczycki explains that in 1989 he did not understand that the famine was a Holodomor. In 1990, the fabrication myth of the Holodomor had not yet become obligatory, the Ukrainian Nationalist Party line. To be purged equals death? Shapoval has nothing about the purged, i.e. demoted officials sharing the fate of those whose deaths they were now bringing about, i.e. suffering execution. Snyder apparently invented this as he invented the 5 million murdered. Even Shapoval does not claim that these sources have any bearing at all on Snyder's point, the question of whether the famine was deliberate. Davies' years 138 has nothing about any purges of the Heights or of anything else in Snyder's paragraph. Davies discusses January 1933 in the pages beginning at page 197. There is nothing about the Heights here either. Collective farming did not work. Snyder makes the following claim, which can only be called bizarre. Quote, Ukrainians who chose not to resist the collective farms believed that they had at least escaped deportation, but now they could be deported because collective farming did not work. Some 15,000 peasants were deported from Soviet Ukraine between February and April 1933, just east and south of Soviet Ukraine, in parts of the Russian Republic of the Soviet Union inhabited by Ukrainians. Some 60,000 people were deported for failing to make grain quotas. In 1933, some 142,000 more Soviet citizens were sent to the Gulag, most of them either hungry or sick with typhus, many of them from Soviet Ukraine. Sources. On the 15,000 people deported, Davies' years 210. On the 60,000 people deported from Kuban, Martin, Ethnic Cleansing, page 846. End quote. Snyder's claim that collective farming did not work is ideologically motivated nonsense. There had been famines for 1,000 years in Russia and in the Ukraine long before collective farming. Like it or not, and Snyder obviously doesn't, collective farming put an end to the age-old cycle of famines. The collective farms worked until the end of the USSR when they were forcibly dissolved. Evidently, Snyder is trying to please today's Ukrainian nationalists, who favor the kulaks and despise the poor peasants, many of whom helped the collectivization movement. For a great many poor peasants did help collectivization and also helped grain procurement. The late James E. Mace, a hero to Ukrainian nationalists and a staunch anti-communists, reluctantly acknowledged the important role of the committees of poor peasants in the collectivization movement in the Ukraine. Davies' years 211 relates that 15,000 households, not peasants, were exiled for refusing to collect in the seed and to sow, and for much vaguer reasons. Davies refers briefly to archival materials. These persons were clearly not starving since they had grain, including seed grain. Deportations and Martin's error. Martin, Ethnic Cleansing, 846, states, ultimately a total of approximately 60,000 Kuban Cossacks were deported for failing to meet their grain requisitions. The 2005-volume Stalinitsky Deportatsy gives the number as 45,790. However, Martin's whole article is of questionable reliability, since it contains at least one serious error. On this same page, 846, Martin states, the December 14th Politburo decree ordered the deportation of the entire Kuban Cossack town of Poltava for the sabotage of grain delivery. Martin is in error. Poltava is a city in the Ukraine. Its inhabitants were not deported. Martin had confused this town with Stanitsa Polatsivakala, or just plain Polatsivakaya, a Cuban Cossack village in the Krasnodar region of Russia. All of its 9,000 inhabitants were deported in December 1932 for sabotage of grain collection, and the town was resettled by demobilized Red Army men and renamed Red Army Village. The Bolsheviks published a booklet explaining why its inhabitants had been deported. This pamphlet is cited in Roy Medvedev's book, Let History Judge. Today, the whole text of that pamphlet is available to anyone on the internet. There's no excuse for this elementary error by Martin. The deportations in question were from the Kuban. Moreover, Martin explicitly states, these were Kuban Cossacks, not Ukrainians. Cossacks do not consider themselves either Ukrainians or Russians, though Kuban Cossacks usually speak Ukrainian. Snyder evidently wants us to believe that this was somehow an anti-Ukrainian action, and so does not say the Kuban, but instead uses the clumsy circumlocution parts of the Russian Republic of the Soviet Union inhabited by Ukrainians. This is another passage suggesting that Snyder is trying to conform to the historical falsehoods of Ukrainian nationalists. According to the authoritative book Stalinitsky Deportatsy,
1928 to 1953, 2005, published by the strongly anti-communist and anti-Stalin Memorial Society. During 1932, 313,000 kulaks and others were deported from various areas to western Siberia, Kazakhstan, the Urals, and elsewhere. Snyder gives no evidence for the following statement. In 1933, some 142,000 more Soviet citizens were sent to the Gulag, most of them either hungry or sick with typhus, many of them from Soviet Ukraine. Neither Davies nor Martin say anything about any 1933 sending of Soviet citizens to the Gulag, as Snyder claims in the passage under discussion, much less that they were hungry or sick with typhus, or that many were from Soviet Ukraine. Snyder. In the camps they tried to find enough to eat, since the Gulag had a policy of feeding the strong and depriving the weak, and these deportees were already weak from hunger. This was desperately difficult. When hungry prisoners poisoned themselves by eating wild plants and garbage, camp officials punished them for shirking. At least 67,297 people died of hunger and related illnesses in the camps, and 241,355 perished in the special settlements in 1933, many of them natives of Soviet Ukraine. Untold thousands more died on the long journey from Ukraine to Kazakhstan or the far north. Their corpses were removed from the trains and buried on the spot, their names and their numbers unrecorded. Sources: Note 73, page 467. On the 67,297 people who died in the camps, Kavelnyuk, Gulag, page 62, page 77. On the 241,355,000 people who died in the special settlements, Viola, unknown Gulag, 241. End quote. Oleg V. Kavelnyuk, The History of the Gulag from Collectivization to the Great Terror, Yale University Press, 2004, 77, does indeed cite this figure. Kavelnyuk usefully gives the death rate for 1932, 4.8%, and for 1933, 15.2%, assuming the difference is due to the famine. If 4.8% of the 448,000 prisoners in 1933 had died, that would be 21,121 people instead of 67,297, meaning that about 46,176 deaths in 1933 were above the rate of 1932 and thus largely or wholly attributable to the famine. But this doesn't really tell us anything. Nobody denies that there was a terrible famine in 1932 to 1933. The question is, was the famine man-made by collectivization and deliberate in that Stalin took grain away from starving people for purposes of political punishment? These figures tell us nothing about this. Lynn Viola, The Unknown Gulag, The Lost World of Stalin's Special Settlements, Oxford University Press, 2007, cites the figure of 241,355 deaths on page 141, not page 241. Viola herself cites V. N. Zemskov, Spet Poslinsky, v. SSSR, 1930 to 1960, Moscow, Nauka, 2003. Zemenskov's figures are 89,754 deaths in 1932 and 151,601 in 1933, for the total of 241,355. These figures tell us nothing about the famine. The special settlements, as their name implies, were villages, not prisons, and included families, old persons, parents, children. There is no indication how many of these people died above the number that would be expected to die in non-famine years. Conclusion: Snyder gives no evidence for the following statements: that the Gulag had a policy of feeding the strong and depriving the weak, that hungry prisoners were punished for shirking, for eating wild plants and garbage, that untold thousands died on the journey, or that no records were kept of such deaths. Evidently, he has invented these facts. Snyder relates more horror stories of starving people. Whether these specific stories are true or not is not important. Terrible things happen during famines, so these stories could be true, and if they are not, others similar to them undoubtedly were. But they have nothing whatsoever to do with the issue of whether the famine was man-made, deliberate or not. They do not even help us understand whether the Soviet authorities should have handled it differently than they did. Snyder. 500,000 youngsters in watchtowers. In a broader sense, though, it was politics as well as starvation that destroyed families, turning a younger generation against an older. Members of the young communists served in the brigades that requisitioned food. Still younger children in the pioneers were supposed to be the eyes and ears of the party inside the family. The healthier ones were assigned to watch over the fields, to prevent theft. 500,000 pre-adolescent and young teenage boys and girls stood in the watchtowers observing adults In Soviet Ukraine in summer 1933, all children were expected to report on their parents. Sources: note 79, page 467 on the 500,000 boys and girls in the watchtowers, Maksudov, Victory 213, quotation, Kuzner's Ukrainia 119. Kuzner's does have this quotation on page 119, the eyes and ears of the party and the family. It is the familiar story of Pavlik Morozov. Maksudov's falsification. Maksudov, Victory 213, states, surveillance towers appeared across the countryside. Mounted patrols hid in ambush. Adults and even small children were employed to spy on their friends and relatives. Kosiar estimated that 500,000 pioneers guarded the fields from their own parents during the summer of 1933. The law of August 7th that threatened execution or imprisonment for anyone caught stealing grain came to be called the Ears of Wheat Law. Maksudov's note, 58, page 234, says, Ivan Trifonov. Moscow, 1960, page 258. Here is what Trifonov actually wrote. The best assistants of the political departments were the Komsomol members. In all the collective farms of the North Caucasus, the Komsomol established light cavalry squads, detachments vigilantly guarded public property, and struggled against damage by animals, detained thieves, and plunderers. In Ukraine in 1933, 540,000 children took part in the collection of ears and crop protection. In the collective farms of the Republic worked 240,000 Komsomol members and 160 Komsomol shock brigades in repairing tractors. Maksudov has seriously falsified this passage. Trifonov says nothing about surveillance towers, about any statement at all by Kosiar, about pioneers guarding the fields from their own parents, or about children spying on their friends and relatives, or, as Snyder adds, about reporting on their parents. The 500,000 children Trifonov mentions were not standing in the watchtowers, as Snyder claims, but helping to glean the fields and protect the crops. The law of 3 years, this is in fact the sobriquet of this law, punished theft of government property, including the property of collective farms and cooperatives. Michael Ellman, a very anti-communist researcher, claims that 11,000 persons were executed under this law, but gives no evidence whatsoever for this statement. Ellman, 2007, page 686. The relevant document available to Ellman in 2007, but evidently not used by him, states that 2,052 persons had been sentenced to death under the law. A number of cases of very large-scale theft are noted in this report to Stalin of March 20th, 1933. It does not note how many of these death sentences were commuted, though such commutations were generally frequent. This law was supported by many peasants, as Tauger argues, quote, Without question, however, many other peasants had worked willingly during the whole period, earning many labor days and siding with the system. As an example of this, we can consider peasants' views of the notorious 7th of August 1932 law on socialist property, which authorized arrests of people for thefts and imposed capital punishment in some cases, and under which more than 100,000 people, mostly peasants, were arrested. An OGPU study of peasant attitudes towards this law in Ivanovo Oblast found that most peasants supported it and even considered it overdue because of numerous outrages and scandals involving theft that they had witnessed and could not prevent. Tauger, 2004, pages 85 to 86. End quote. Snyder cites a document in the multi-volume Tragedia Sovetskoy Derevny, Tragedy of the Soviet Countryside, edited by staunch opponents of collectivization, but still a very useful collection of primary source materials. The document in question, a report on the reaction of peasants in a certain region to the August 7th, 1932 law, contains a section on negative reactions, but a longer one on positive reactions, with examples given. On February 1st, 1933, the Politburo decreed that the following persons should not be prosecuted under this law. Quote, those guilty of individual acts of petty theft of public property or workers who have committed theft because of need, poverty, or from lack of consciousness and in the presence of other mitigating circumstances, end quote. This was confirmed by an order of the Presidium, the executive body of the Soviet government, of March 27, 1933. A joint instruction of the Central Committee and the Central Executive Committee, that is the main bodies of the party and the government, of May 8, 1933, greatly restricted the punishments under this law. Several other decrees limited punishment under this law and released persons convicted under it. In any case, it is evident that the 500,000 pioneers and their parents were not starving. Snyder relates more horrifying stories, none of which have any bearing on the issue at hand, whether the starvation was deliberate. Why were those in charge of the 1937 census arrested? Snyder, quote, The Soviet census of 1937 found 8 million fewer people than projected. Most of these were famine victims in Soviet Ukraine, Soviet Kazakhstan, and Soviet Russia, and the children that they did not then have. Stalin suppressed its findings and had the responsible demographers executed. In 1933, Soviet officials in private conversations most often provided the estimate of 5.5 million dead from hunger. This seems roughly correct, if perhaps somewhat low, for the Soviet Union in the early 1930s, including Soviet Ukraine, Soviet Kazakhstan, and Soviet Russia. Note 87, page 467 on the Soviet census, see Shologl, Ter. For discussion of 5.5 million as a typical estimate, see Dalrymple's Soviet Famine 259. End quote. Karl Schlogl, Ter und Traum, Moscow, 1937, Munich, 2007, isn't an easy book for most readers to find, so why pick it? Possibly because it is another work of the USSR Land of Terror school, relentlessly anti-communist. It is devoid of any effort at historical objectivity, and is full of outright falsifications. Dalrymple's article is from the 1960s, merely an attempt to establish that there had indeed been a famine. Far more recent estimates have been made by recent scholarly studies. Mark Tauger estimates roughly 5 million deaths as a result of the famine, but others estimate a much lower figure. The careful Ukrainian-Canadian scholar John Paul Himka writes, quote, "These could not be specialists in demography. However, since all recent studies based on a careful analysis of census data come up with numbers in the range of 2.6 to 3.9 million, Jacques Vallin, Franz Melez, Sergei Adamets, and Serhiy Piroskov, a new estimate of Ukrainian population losses during the crisis of the 1930s and 1940s, Population Studies, 56, 3, 2002, 249-64, this study arrives at the figure of 2.6 million. End quote. The 1937 census was not canceled because the population count was too low, as hinted by Snyder and stated by Schlogl. It was declared defective and rescheduled for 1939 when the questions about nationality were simplified, the questions about literacy were changed, and the question about religious belief was omitted altogether, so respondents did not have to say whether they were religious or not. Several of those in charge of the census were indeed arrested, tried, and in at least one case executed, but this had nothing to do with the census. Ivan Adamovich Kraval, the main official in charge of the census, was named by one of the defendants in the March 1938 Moscow trial, the Bukharin-Rykov trial, as a member of the right Trotskyite conspiracy against the Soviet government and party leadership. The census was canceled in January 1937, but Kraval was not even arrested until May. In fact, as early as January 11, 1937, Kraval had been named as a clandestine Bukharinite from as far back as 1919 to 1921 and again in 1924 by Valentin Astrov, also a Bukharin supporter and member of his school. This is significant because Astrov lived until 1933, long enough to write that the NKVD had not mistreated him in any way, and that his testimony to them against Bukharin and his supporters was truthful, not the result of any compulsion. Lazar S. Brandingler, another leading census official, was also arrested, tried, and convicted of involvement in a right Trotskyite conspiracy. He was not executed, but sentenced to 10 years in a camp. Fortunately, there are a number of Russian studies of the Soviet census of 1937 where all these matters are explained. Snyder failed to consult any of them. End of appendix of chapter 3.